Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Duke, and I'm joined for yet another series of conversations with Dr. Sandy Stotsky. We just finished a conversation about the state of the schools now in the Biden administration, what we can expect, what's coming down the road. And now we're going to do a series of talks on really a critically important aspect of public schooling. In fact, you could argue that much of the trouble we're having as a country today comes from the fact that we have been very poorly able, or largely unable, or unwilling to give our kids a serious education in actual history, real history, and civics. Our young kids for 30 years now have been getting through the public schools with a completely misinformed view of American history, and over the last 10 years, an incredibly ideologically driven view of history. We're seeing now the 1619 curriculum is going to be shortly entering the schools. We see a very social justice themed history program in the public schools, one that doesn't take into account growth and change over time. And most alarmingly, perhaps, we're seeing a view of what little history is being taught to our kids is highly anti-American and very low in civics, informing kids on what their rights and responsibilities are. Sandy Stotsky, you have dealt with this, many things. You were a Common Core, one of the major Common Core people who rejected the standards, and they went ahead and certified them anyway. You've dealt with, you're an English language arts professor, but you do have a great deal of experience with civics and history education. So talk a little bit, if you can, about where we are now, briefly, and you go and I'll go, and then we'll talk about some broader things. But how did we get in this mess? How did we get into a situation where what American history we're teaching is ultimately negative, or that the only thing we're willing to teach kids are negative aspects of our history and culture? And I can't think of another. Can you? You've been all over the world. I can't think of another culture, even cultures with very dangerous backgrounds, like Germany, for instance. They don't teach, German kids in German public high schools don't get a view of Germany that is nearly as negative as American kids are getting in the public schools now about their own country.
I can't go into the details of what is happening in our general culture, but let me remind people what was in the school K-12 curriculum for maybe a couple of hundred years almost. We used to have, years ago in grade 8, a course called Civics. It was a war horse kind of course, talked about the 3 branches of government and the differences between the federal, state, and local level in various ways. And then we had a year of U.S. history in grade 11. Much depended upon the textbook that teachers used. Fortunately, in the North, we used for many generations a high school history textbook that had been written by David Muzzy, and a historian, and it was used, as I say, for several generations and gave a broad view of U.S. history. What happened during the turbulent days of the 60s and 70s in this country, the Warhorse Civics course disappeared. It was charged that kids didn't like history courses that consisted of dates and times and names, and that was all that it was. And the civics course was simply something that kids memorized. So that was dumped. And there was often nothing left in middle school or in junior high school that took its place. The U.S. history began to be fiddled with because it was felt that it needed to accommodate various groups. One of the first kinds of changes in the 60s and 70s was something called an Afrocentric curriculum, for which there's never been any evidence that it stimulated kids to learn history or to be more motivated for higher academic achievement in general. So we've had problems all along with what to substitute for those few grades that are left for a sequential course in history, which is the only way history will make sense to kids if there's some sequence chronologically to what is taught. Now, we've also had different changes taking place at the high school level in placement, and we've had AP courses. And as many parents may know, there is a battle being waged right now about the AP courses in U.S. history or European history or U.S. government as to how much influence they have on what is taught in all of the other grades, depending upon how seriously the school system is trying to prepare kids for the advanced placement course in history in either grade 11 or 12. We have various issues with the placement of many of these kinds of historical topics. For one thing, there are many documents that should be read. Our seminal documents are best read by high school students. And years ago, that took place, the Declaration of Independence I'm talking about, or the preamble to the Constitution, in grade 8. Unfortunately, the words that are used in our seminal document are basically more suitable for young adults than for middle schoolers. So kids aren't gaining that much. There are a few states, because I once did a survey of all the reading requirements across all the states. I contacted people who were coordinators or history chairmen about what was being required by the state legislature, because whatever the state legislature required, that had to be taught. And typically, if they required anything at all, they required a year of U.S. history, or they required the reading of the Constitution's preamble or the Declaration of Independence. Few states, like Massachusetts, required the reading of the state's constitution, because in Massachusetts we were fortunate. John Adams wrote our state constitution, and we wanted to make sure that kids still remembered that. But the reading requirements are minimal. They can be amplified everywhere. The problem was that over the years there was an ideology as well about what should be accomplished by a history curriculum. It was the major way in which students learned how to see each other as citizens in this country, which has been lost. They have identity issues to this day, but these identity issues are not civic identity issues. They are, whether they may be gender issues or ethnic or racial issues, but they don't help students to see everyone else who attends their schools as sharing in the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. And citizenship was always the raison d'etre, the reason for having a K-12 public education system. Did it prepare kids for citizenship? Not college and career. Those were secondary. Most people, for hundreds of years, did not go to college. Very few ever went to college. When we started having the census results in 1900 of the number of adolescents who went on to college, it was about 3% of that youth cohort. So we've had college as the goal only in recent decades, and it's not worked well. We've talked about that. The Common Core standards have not made all students college ready, and they can't, because not all students want to go to college. So we have a problem that way. But we have documents that have been designed to help schools. They're simply not used the way they should be. I'm going to show one of them because it probably is the best to draw upon, and it's called National Standards for Civics and Government. It came out in '94 to national acclaim by both Democrats and Republicans, and it was all about civics and government. U.S. history was there, and it still is available, and its standards can be copied, used, changed in some ways, but it's rarely used. It's there, In Massachusetts, we had to produce according to what the state legislature decided in the Massachusetts Education Reform Act in '93. We came up with Massachusetts History and Social Science curriculum framework. History was always the backbone. That was how students learned about the development of democratic principles and what it meant to live in a constitutional republic, which is what we have. So we have wonderful documents available, but we have this ideological problem in high school today whereby some history teachers and others felt students should be more active. They introduced a service component, which you probably have heard about. States introduced many of them, a service component, but it had very little that was an academic component for this service requirement, which could be just working in the local library, shelving books, or working for a local political party. Students might often just end up being gophers, and it just didn't work out for academic purposes. But nevertheless, the idea that we needed more civic participation and less civic knowledge doesn't work. There may have been too much of a stress in the first few hundred years on civic knowledge and concepts, so that students spent too much of their time in their seats and they didn't actively do anything. Some elementary teachers tried to get kids to learn how to send a bill through their legislature, and we often got state insects, state flowers, state animals out of these kinds of bills. So they learned what a bill went through in order to become a bill for the state. But it didn't retain its power to help them become more effective citizens as adults. So we have a lot of problems with the K-12 history curriculum. I am showing documents that would be useful today to help us address, for a variety of purposes, many of the problems we have, where we have students who see very little in common with each other because they don't see each other as American citizens. When I grew up, we all knew what languages we used in everybody's home, but nevertheless, we all knew that we were all citizens with the same rights and responsibilities. And that has unfortunately been lost. Let me stop here so you word it.
Well, I think that's a really good summary of what's happened, Sandy. And what you said at the end, I think, is particularly important. The sense of Americanness is gone. I think, over the long haul of the last 250 years, maybe a civics course in 8th grade and one American history course in 11th grade, probably insufficient to give kids a real general sense of what the history of the country was. But at least it was an attempt, and at least it stressed one thing. We were all Americans, right? That we all came from someplace else, but we all spoke a particular language, we had a particular set of American values, and we had rights and responsibilities that were guaranteed by our Constitution. That now is gone, as you said, and it's gone for a lot of ideological and tendentious reasons. What may have been a mishap in the 50s, 60s, and 70s has now become a conscious choice to teach kids a very highly ideological sense, not of history. We don't teach kids American history. And this is what I wanted to sort of end this segment with. It seems to me that the notion of America is gone, that far too many educrats, far too many colleges of education have become very progressive and very left-wing in their approach, very quasi-socialist, if not Marxist, in the way they interpret textbooks. You mentioned the old book that you guys used to use in Massachusetts. Well, certainly in the 70s, the revolution was the shift to a different kind of history, right? The idea that America viewed through the lens of socialism and populism. You think about those textbooks that were so popular and it had such an impact on the culture. But it seems to me that we're in a place now where the people who are in charge of our kids' education and their history classes and what they're going to learn don't believe in America. They see America as a construct, a negative construct, a racist construct, and ultimately illegitimate. What you said at the end of your talk there was nice. We don't see them as Americans anymore. They are black, or they are white, or they are indigenous. They are BIPOC people. And emphasizing this is not only balkanizing the country more, but it's actually pitting Americans against each other. If you're white, you represent all that's evil in the culture. If you are white, you are born with certain privileges. Somehow, innately, you know things that other people can't have access to. And it's turning into, really, in my mind, we are using the public schools to re-ensconce racist ideas in our education system. That if you are one race, you're guilty, or you need to be pulled down, or you deserve to be lowered in your achievement because of the history of your ancestors. And in other instances, because of what your ancestors may have suffered along the lines, we have to give you a pass. We won't teach you the same things. We'll not ask you to believe or participate in the idea that there is one America. And it just seems that not only are we balkanizing kids and pitting kids against each other, we are on top of all of that, really driving, I think, what the civil rights movement tried to remove, right? The inherent sense of race. We're putting it right back in front and center.
Yes, we are failing the students, which is the thrust of what you're saying, because we're not helping them to see other students as their civic kin. And it's that the cultivation of that attitude that is sorely missing today. And we need basically to teach children what are the common things they share, regardless of their shade or color of skin, or whether they're boys or girls, or their parents came from Africa, Europe, or Asia, or wherever. There are certain things. This has always been known as a country that did not have blood as the kinship mechanism, as in many other nation states around the world. You were related in some way. You all spoke the same language in your home. That's not true. We've never had that. We had, for example, at the time of our founding, a large portion of our population spoke German. That was a worry of Benjamin Franklin, as a matter of fact, that German might become the national language, leaving all those who spoke English with a dilemma about what they should use for daily life. But all of our seminal documents are English, and all of our rules and laws and basic principles are available in English. So students need to be taught what those are and how they can use them successfully in their local as well as state and federal roles as citizens. And we have forgotten that for maybe hundreds of years, because I come from Massachusetts, where we learned about what happened in Plymouth County from 1620 on, that there was a lot of time for local communities to develop their sense of kinship about what they had in common. They had to take care of their own roads, their own poor. They had to have a schools that at least taught kids how to read and write something at a minimal level. So we have to go back, I think, and help students to recapture what it meant to be part of deciding how your local taxes should be spent. There is nothing like having fights about how to spend your own tax money to this day. And I can tell you, after having been a town meeting member in Brookline, that nothing is closer to the heart of the average citizen than how their snow is going to be plowed and how trash is going to be collected. These become major issues, and the costs of this, their property taxes, if they have to pay them. And that's true in most states. But this is what we haven't given our students. We've tried to take away the burden of supposedly they're having to afford some of the things they want. But poor farmers hundreds of years ago had to learn how to spend their money wisely so they could get the bang for their buck that they wanted, but it had to be their money, and they then watched carefully to see how that money was spent. We simply don't care, and that's what's happening right now, too. We have money just simply being spent on things that nobody is accountable for, even in schools, and it doesn't do any good. But hard questions have to be asked, and that's what I would want.
Let me, as we wind this up, and I'm going to ask you for a brief response here, and this will set up, I think, our next discussion in part 2. Given that we have, and you were an educator, you were a college professor, you know what it's like, Sandy, that over the years, with each passing decade, the professoriate, the theorizers of education become more politically radical and less politically pro-American. How do we, the mom and dad, who pay for these schools, who kids go to those schools, how do we convince an educational establishment that doesn't take us seriously, that no longer sees our partnership as necessary to educate our children, who seem like they have their own mandates and their own political agendas? How would we, the American parents who pay for all of this, remind the educrats that we are all Americans and that the idea of America is not some chimera, not some illusion? It's a real thing that can be documented and seen, and we have some obligation to teach our kids about that. How do we, as mom and dads, do that, given the incredible left-wing tilt of education at all the highest levels, the people making the decisions?
There are many unanswerable questions. The one start I have been recommending is that we should try to get Congress to get the USED, which is a relatively new cabinet area or cabinet position, the U.S. Secretary of Education, just get rid of it altogether. No money from the federal government. It started with ESEA in 1965. Get the federal government, bureaucrats who are in Washington, for the most part, Washington, D.C., out of the picture of local education. Leave it to local, plus a little bit of input from state government. They can determine how many days of school you need per year, or how much time per week should be spent on physical ed. We had an argument in Massachusetts about that. But let the local level handle what it always did and pay for the costs and be conscious of their paying for the costs of education. Having the federal government has not helped the low-income child at all. There's just no evidence that low-income students have been helped by the federal largesse that has come from having the USED involved by way of these appropriations through the various title programs. It's just given money to be spent on anything a superintendent feels they can justify to their local school board. I'm certainly not saying that local school boards are the answer to all of our problems, but at least that keeps it at a level that's reachable by the average parent. And we can start that way to see if we can get curriculum developed by groups of teachers and parents. They've just been shut out. And that's an easy enough legislative law to pass, that any part of the school curriculum that is developed must be developed by groups of teachers with parents. Now, how they're chosen and what parents becomes another political game, because I've seen them all. But at least that gets it started so that expertise in the subject area is useful. If you want a science curriculum or a foreign language curriculum, you have to have people who speak the language, who know about that K-12 development of young people in that language, in that country. You can't just pluck adults, for example, for Spanish curriculum. You've got to get people who understand what it means to teach good books for children in Spanish to Spanish-speaking children. I've looked into that whole issue, and I could go on to more details if necessary, but we don't have the time. But at least get the federal government and distant bureaucrats away from what is happening at the local level. That would be a great start.
It's something to move for. I mean, you know, we talked about in our previous segment, our previous documentary about the difficulty of that with an incoming Biden administration. Nevertheless, it is a beginning model of how you would push back, begin to make it less national and much more local. Sandy, thank you for this opening lecture, this opening conversation. And when we come back the next time, we're going to start modeling and because you've done a lot of work with this, doing a little bit more modeling of what an accurate and very useful American history and civics curriculum might look like. Thanks for joining us today.